Hi, welcome to session two of the fourth topic of the semester titled The Texas Revolution of 1836. Now, this is session two, and what we're going to be doing is looking at part two of this topic, which is going to deal with the origins and causes of the Texas Revolution. We're going to look at very specifically Texas, the immediate origins and causes that led to this revolutionary movement of 1836. In session one, if you recall, we just looked at the historical background of the Texas Revolution, meaning that if we look back for 2.5 centuries prior to 1836, there have been a series of radical changes emerging in the Western world, particularly Western Europe, England, and also in North America. Those changes brought things like the Protestant Reformation, this religious revolution that centered on the departure of millions of Europeans from the Catholic Church in order to reform the Christian Church. And the way they were reforming the Christian Church is by creating more democratic congregations or churches in control of their own doctrines and the like. Other changes included also the rise of capitalism, the rise of a merchant class in Europe, particularly also in England, that introduced ideas such as private property, for example. That, of course, those changes generated in England a pressure to transform and reform the institutions of England, the monarchy, for example, trying to get the monarchy to become more open, to provide more representation to the merchant class, to respect the rights of merchants to own property and the like. And when those rights were denied, and in many cases violated, we're going to see, of course, the English Civil War. One of the first democratic revolutions, of course, arising in world history. It happened in England in the 1600s. The merchants waged war against the king. The king lost, and of course, we see a series of changes taking place in England. A parliamentary system of government with a new Bill of Rights in which property was now honored and respected, and a separation of church and state, of course. Then we saw, of course, the Enlightenment, this period of intense philosophical writings in Europe that proposed new ways of creating a government. Governments that will be created for the sole purpose of protecting certain rights, what's called natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and also the ideas of the consent of the governed. Those ideas are going to become the inspiration for the American Revolution. The second democratic revolution happened in North America when the 13 British colonies declared independence from Great Britain, precisely because the rights of merchants, planters, and farmers were also violated. Life, liberty, and property. And of course, we see the Declaration of Independence, written in 1776, in which the colonists are very aware that this is the kind of government that we want to create. We are moving away from England because we want to create a government that respects people's rights of life, liberty, and property, and of course, a separation of church and state. And of course, we see the formation of the American Republic, in 1787. We saw that in part one, in the first session. And again, this is the historical background of the Texas Revolution. The Texas Revolution, as we'll see in the second session, is going to borrow a lot of those ideas that we just discussed and reenact them in 1836. That is to say, Texas felt that the revolutionaries, at least those that were moving towards independence, that their rights were violated, and they were declaring independence from Mexico in order to form an independent state that will have a constitution that will honor those kinds of rights. Again, this is a continuity of previous upheavals, if you will. The Texas Revolution was part of this series of revolutionary upheavals that were trying to create a more liberal state, that is to say, based on human liberty and human rights and the like. Not that that it was the ideal state or perfect state, but this is again part of this process again of change. Okay, so let us now turn our attention to our outline so we can begin part two of this topic, the Texas Revolution, looking at the causes and the origins. And we start again by looking at perhaps one of the most fundamental reasons why Texas is going to declare independence from Mexico has to do precisely with Mexico's feudal institutions. Remember, all of the revolutions that we discussed in session one, whether it's the English Civil War or the American Revolution, were really revolutions that question the old feudal order. We discussed that at the very beginning of session one, monarchy, aristocracy, and the church. That's exactly what is taking place in Mexico, and that Mexico, although it attains its independence from Spain in 1821 and becomes an independent republic, in 1824 it forms a republic very similar to the United States system, with a constitution that was strikingly similar to the U.S. Constitution. Well, despite that fact that Mexico is somehow trying to create a liberal state with a liberal form of government, it still retains a lot of the old Spanish feudal institutions. Ultimately, Spain introduced in their colonies her own feudal institutions that were very old, to say the least, and governed the colonies through those institutions. And even though those Spanish colonies were gaining independence, like Mexico, for example, those colonies are still, or those new nations, that is to say, those new republics, are still struggling with this old feudal past, that is to say. Okay? And those feudal institutions that Spain introduced in Mexico during the colonial period were headquartered in Mexico City. Mexico City was the capital of New Spain, this colony that was called New Spain, that today is simply called Mexico. So it is in Mexico City that the seat of power was created by the Spanish to rule New Spain, to rule this vast colony. And even after independence, those feudal institutions pretty much remained very powerful as this new nation proceeded forward, trying to create a more liberal state. Despite that fact, again, those feudal institutions remained pretty much powerful. And we're talking about, in this case, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church in Mexico remained the dominant faith. It was considered really the only faith in Mexico. The Catholic Church in Mexico enjoyed a monopoly of religious beliefs and practices. They pretty much dominated all of the ceremonies, the rituals, the beliefs of the population were all contained within the Catholic institution. And they were not only the dominant and only faith of Mexico, but there were also tax collectors. They reserved the right to tax the population. They own a lot of land. It is estimated that anywhere between 30 to 50% of all of the land of Mexico was in the hands of the church. So they were a large landowner. And they were also in charge of education. Okay? Education in Mexico was religious. If you wanted to get education, you needed to attend a Catholic school, that is to say. So they even control the minds, if you will, of the future generations, if you will. They molded the minds of the future generations. This was considered necessary by the followers and supporters of the church in order to maintain order. Okay, that it was necessary for the church to remain dominant and strong if Mexican society was to be stable and follow the traditions of the past and so on, that the Spaniards left in Mexico, which were very cherished and valued by conservative groups in Mexico. The other institution was the aristocracy. Remember the landowners. We talked about landowners in Europe, for example. They composed the aristocracy. In Mexico, there are feudal landowners. There are individuals that own a lot of land. There's a large landed estates. And they're mostly concentrated around Mexico City in the Central Valley of Mexico, the largest landowners, that is to say. So they wielded economic power. They were the major producers in Mexico of things like cattle and grain, for example, and textiles. Everything that was produced in their landed estates, called the hacienda, by the way, a hacienda, or, let me just write it right here. The hacienda. And they're also very dominant as well in terms of controlling policy, Mexican politics. In many cases, they are governing Mexico alongside with the church. Now, the other feudal institution that remains in a modified form in Mexico is not really a monarchy, because Mexico is a republic. By 1824, Mexico becomes now a republic. Of course, it has no monarchy. There are, of course, presidents that serve for 6 years or 4 years, depending. It's been amended several times, the term limits of the presidents. But the type of leadership that the Mexican president exercises is very, very monarchical. In Mexico City, a president is really considered a monarch that serves for a very limited time. It's almost like an absolute ruler. It's not that the Constitution allows the president to exercise an absolute power, but this was the tradition back when the Spaniards were governing the colony. After all, New Spain was governed by viceroys. A viceroy is like a vice king. There was like a representative of the Spanish king in New Spain, in Mexico City. A person that served for life. And he was indeed like a little monarch, if you will. But now, in this period of nationhood, that Mexico doesn't have a monarchy, well, the presidents behave in that fashion. Okay? Very controlling, very dominant, and they think of themselves as a little king, if you will. So again, this is not really a monarchy, but rather is a modified form of it, if you will. Okay? But it's still very much present during this time, as Mexico moves into nationhood and is creating a republic again. It has still very strong feudal institutions, the church, an aristocracy or the feudal landowners, and of course the kind of presidency that exists in Mexico that is very monarchical. And again, this is going to be problematic, as we'll see, for the residents of Texas, that as we'll see, Texas is going to, over time, become very liberal, a liberal community, a liberal society that saw Mexico City as antiquated, as old-fashioned, still very much trapped in the past, with institutions that were not really allowing progress to take place in the state, in the province of Texas. All right, so we move now to the second cause or origin of the Texas Revolution. And the second cause of the Texas Revolution deals with the situation of Texas in relationship to Mexico City. Ever since the colonial period, when Texas was first settled and colonized by Spain in 1689. Of course, this is a territory that was already incorporated into the colony of New Spain, but it was not really populated or settled by Spanish residents until the late 1600s. We covered that, of course, in an earlier topic. And ever since 1689, when we see the very first little towns created, the presidios and the missions created in Texas, Texas was so far removed from Mexico City that it was a province on the outskirts, if you will, of the colony, so far away that this colony, this little province called Texas, this little colony called Texas, was very much self-ruled or self-governed, if you will, what is called autonomous. Autonomous, remember, autonomous is like self-governed or self-ruled. Because it was so far away from the capital, Mexico City. Okay? This province was very isolated geographically speaking. It was on the northern fringes of New Spain. So far away, so far removed that by the time there was a policy enacted in Mexico City, by the time this policy was announced in Texas, it would take not days or weeks or months, sometimes even years, for this policy to even be announced in the province of Texas. And even so, the residents of Texas were not really that affected, again, by the policies of Mexico City very early on. Okay, this geographical isolation was an advantage to the residents of Texas in that they were carrying out their daily activities. They were pretty much carrying out their own lives in isolation, if you will, that they were pretty much, on their own. If we add to this that there was a lack of transportation technology, there are no really advanced systems of transportation that will facilitate trade or will facilitate the carrying of messages or administrative policies to be enacted, to be enforced in this very far away province. Well, that placed Texas in a great advantage, once again, in terms of developing a kind of autonomous status. Okay, they're pretty much governing themselves. They're pretty much isolated from Mexico, that is to say. Okay, so again, the sense in Texas very early on is that they were on their own. Yeah, they're part of New Spain. They understand that, but they just don't feel so much tied or close to Mexico City. Okay. So again, this was a situation that will remain even into the early 1800s. We see in Texas the towns pretty much being self-governed. The autonomous towns, the ones we mentioned, of course, earlier in the semester, like, for example, San Antonio, Nuevo Laredo, for example, Nacogdoches. Those towns were pretty much self-governed. They were governed by city councils, members of the community. In many cases, those were actually cattle ranchers that were the ones in sitting in those city councils, making the decisions for the town when it comes to, for example, taxes, when it comes to trade or building a road, etc. Anything that the town required, the city council had to meet and make a decision, and they were making decisions on their own. They were not really following the orders of Mexico City. Okay, they were not in direct communication with Mexico City, carrying out the wills, the signs of the politicians in Mexico City, but rather pretty much creating their own policies at the local level. Okay. Now, this is the situation that Texas enjoyed throughout the Spanish colonial period, all the way to independence. So, when the time came for Mexico's independence in 1821 and finally creating a republic in 1824, adopting a constitution that was, as I said, similar, if not identical, to the U.S. Constitution of 1787. This is a constitution that created a federal system of government. Okay, so what is a federal system of government? A federal system of government is a government that divides power into three levels. There is the local level, the towns of a state. That is one level of government called the local. The second level of government is the state. In other words, the country has many states, and each state has been given the right to govern its own region. Every state has a different constitution, different laws, and so on, that correspond to that locality, to that region, and so on. But there's a third level, and that is the federal level of government, that is the one above the state and the local. And the federal level of government is overseeing and supervising the activities of the states and the towns, if you will. So what this means is that every town and every state is granted a certain degree of autonomy or self-governance. They're not totally independent, but they're granted a certain degree of independence to, once again, create their own laws, create their own policies, to address their own local or state problems. So this constitution, called the Federal Constitution of 1824, this Mexican Constitution, pretty much reinforced this autonomy that Texas had enjoyed in the past during the Spanish colonial period. Now Texas, under this constitution, can continue ruling its own affairs, governing its own affairs. The towns can remain kind of independent. The city councils in control of each town are going to be writing policy for each town, the like, not necessarily being at the mercy of Mexico City, waiting for what Mexico City has to say, but rather they're going to be pretty much crafting their own laws and policies on their own. So this Federalist Constitution was really welcomed with open arms in Texas. You know, it was just reinforcing this semi-independent position that they have been in for quite a time. In other words, and they're going to remain in that position under this constitution. Okay, so we move into the third cause or origin of the Texas Revolution of 1824. And like in session 1, if you recall, the revolutionary movements we looked at, whether it was the English Civil War or the American Revolution, we also see that in Texas, the rise of capitalism played a key role in creating the conditions for insurrection and revolution. We see, for example, in the English Civil War or in the American Revolution, that with the rise of capitalism, we see the rise of a merchant class. Okay, a rise, a class of merchants and entrepreneurs, investors in many cases, that were generating different kinds of enterprises. Enterprises that were generating wealth for them. Again, that's what capitalism is really, again, a system of wealth creation or wealth generation, if you will, through some form of enterprise. So that's exactly what we're going to be looking at in Texas, is that there's going to be a group of merchants, some of which are going to be Mexican, others are going to be Americans that will be arriving into Texas. And together, the Mexican merchants and Americans, sometimes even working together, they're going to be transforming the state into a more capitalist economy, okay? Generating different kinds of commercial enterprises, and in the process, they're going to consider their enterprises as their own private property that has to be honored and respected no matter what. And as we'll see, when those interests were threatened, when their private property was at stake, this is going to set off, of course, the conditions for revolution. Okay, the same way it happened in the English Civil War and in the American Revolution. Very similar. That's why I stress, that there was a rise of merchants again in England or in the colonies that created different kinds of enterprises that when those enterprises or interests were affected, they created the insurgency or revolution, if you will. Okay? All right, so let's now talk specifically about the rise of the merchant class and what kind of enterprises they generated. Okay, so Texas is really in transition, is becoming a more, once again, a capitalist economy, is developing a capitalist economy. Something that got started by the actual residents of Texas in the late colonial period. There were, of course, Spanish settlers in Texas when Texas was still part of Spain, by the way, that were the forerunners of capitalism in Texas. We're talking about specifically here the cattle ranchers, the rancher entrepreneurs. Okay, Texas, ever since the very, very beginning, was a cattle state. It was a cattle province, per excellence. That was the dominant form of enterprise in this province, cattle ranching. And there were, of course, different kinds of cattle ranches. There were family size, they were owned by a single family with a handful of cattle, if you will. But there were also mid-sized cattle ranches, but there was also large cattle ranches owned by very wealthy families of Spanish origin, by the way. Okay? Very, very wealthy. And the very wealthy ranchero families were the ones that started developing capitalism in the late colonial period. There was, of course, a great demand for cattle, for beef, in both south of Texas, in the provinces of Nuevo León and Coahuila. Those are actually today Mexican states, by the way, Nuevo León and Coahuila, which are actually border states with Texas, by the way. And those particular states develop a market for beef something that they were willing to buy from the cattle ranchers from Texas. Okay? And of course, the wealthy ranchero families of Texas will raise cattle and then drive the cattle south into cattle markets in Nuevo León and Coahuila to sell them. And of course, they started building great fortunes from those expeditions. There was also a great demand for beef in the east of Texas in what today is New Orleans in Louisiana. Back then, Louisiana, of course, was still part of France. Okay, this is French Louisiana, by the way. And of course, the French in New Orleans were also demanding beef, and they will also create cattle markets in which very wealthy ranchero families from Texas will be driving cattle there. And as they're moving into New Orleans, they're also going to be selling their cattle there and at great prices and coming back to Texas with a lot of money, of course. And this is how, of course, we see in the state of Texas the creation of large enterprises, which was the cattle rancher, enterprise, if you will. Okay, great fortunes. The cattle ranchers, of course, considered their property, their wealth, their cattle, their ranches as their own private property. Not necessarily the property of the King of Spain, but they started really considering that all of their assets, all of their land, if you will, that they operated, etc., it was their own personal, individual, private property. Okay? So this is part of capitalism, if you will, the idea of private property, individual property, that is to say. Okay? So this is, again, very early on, the early beginnings of capitalism in the state of Texas. Also, the ranchero families that have been building great wealth in this province begin to build very close ties to the United States, particularly when France sold Louisiana, which was not only New Orleans, by the way. Louisiana was a territory that comprised what today is really the midsection of the United States, that included the Great Plains, for example, for $15 million. France sold all of that territory, what became known as the Louisiana Purchase, to the United States in 1803. So from 1803, we're no longer talking about French Louisiana. This is now U.S. Okay? So the ranchero families are going to develop very close ties to the American economy as they will continue trading and making business with Americans in Louisiana, that is to say. This is happening precisely in a time when, if you recall, we talked about the Texas independence movement from Spain in the previous topic. Okay, Texas participation in the war for independence from Spain. We talked about that. There was a lot of rancheros or ranchers in Texas that sided with the insurgents, with the Mexican insurgents when they declare independence from Spain. Of course, there's going to be a war also in Texas. The Spanish army moved into Texas, trying to crush the rebellion and so on. And a lot of ranchers that supported the independence from Spain, many of those rebel leaders had to flee Texas, abandon their ranches in many cases, and they went into the United States. They went into New Orleans, escaping the French authorities, that is to say. And they're going to stay there for a good while, for many years. they had already built connections there anyways. They were very well known because of their cattle trails and operations in the past. So they were welcome in many cases by the Americans. And they were received with open arms. And of course, they remained in New Orleans for a good while. And while they stayed in New Orleans, this is now part of the United States, some of those ranchero families, like the Navarro family, for example, one of those rebel leaders that actually stayed in New Orleans was Jose Antonio Navarro. He stayed in New Orleans building very strong personal but also financial connections with American entrepreneurs. He will continue going back to Texas despite the fact that, I mean, his family was persecuted by the Spanish royal forces. He will continue going back to Texas to actually smuggle horses and mules into Texas. Okay, it was prohibited at this time for anybody in Texas to be exporting cattle into the United States. You know, the Spaniards were really trying to crush the Texas economy and, of course, the supporters of independence, of course. So Jose Antonio Navarro was one of those individuals that will continue to import horses and mules into New Orleans. This is, of course, something called smuggling. You know, it was prohibited, but he was nonetheless doing it, you know, because he had, of course, the connections both back in Texas, but also the connections with American merchants at the same time. Okay, so Jose Antonio Navarro is going to be very surprised and pleased with the kind of progress that the Americans had achieved in New Orleans. You know, he was really marveled, if you will, at the kind of economy that New Orleans enjoyed, that it was very dynamic. It was a port for international trade. New Orleans, that is to say, you know, exporting things like cotton and sugar and really creating a lot of wealth, at least for, of course, the major producers of cotton and sugar in New Orleans. So he really got an idea of how Texas could become. In other words, he says, well, you know, if our immediate neighbor here, New Orleans, that is part of the United States, is really creating this kind of society and economy, this is exactly what Texas needs. You know, Texas really needs to develop a capitalist economy. We need to develop enterprises that will generate products for exports, and we need to develop, of course, certain major ports in Texas that will be international ports that will serve to export, whether it's cattle or cotton or sugar. He's getting the same idea. We can also be major exporters, and with this, of course, bring a lot of foreign capital into the state, and of course improve the state, you know, build roads and bridges and the like, you know, to facilitate commerce and trade. So he's really thinking about transforming Texas, something that he's, of course, borrowing from Louisiana. The same kind of model, if you will, the capitalist system of Louisiana. Now, eventually, when Mexico achieved its independence in 1821, Navarro returns to Texas, and he returns to his hometown in San Antonio. He was very well known. It was one of the wealthiest families, again, in San Antonio. That by 1821, when he returns, he becomes the mayor of San Antonio. Once again, it was really the cattle ranchers that were in control of local politics, whether it was through the city councils or just becoming the mayors themselves again. So this is a clear example that as mayor of San Antonio, he's now trying to push certain policies to start attracting capital or investors, particularly Americans. He's going to be a major supporter for welcoming Americans into Texas to bring their ideas, to bring their enterprises, their capital, finance, and the like, to start really transforming the state. That is to say, he's a major promoter of trade with the United States. Particularly, he's building very strong commercial links with New Orleans, Louisiana, as his mayor, of course. And later on, he'll become a senator in Mexico. Okay? He'll be representing the state of Texas in the Senate. And as he's going to be representing Texas in the Senate, he's also going to be pushing for certain changes, certain policies to attract Americans into Texas, something we're going to get to see in just a few moments. Now, in Mexico, what we're going to be looking at is that there's going to be a growing group of intellectuals and politicians who call themselves liberals. They're all over Mexico. And when we talk about Texas, most of the cattle ranchers, particularly the wealthy ones, are part of this group. They call themselves the liberals. Jose Antonio Navarro, by the way, considers himself a liberal as well. They were known also as the Federalists because they were not only endorsing the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment of life, liberty, and property, but also they endorsed the idea of capitalism. Okay, the liberals are staunch supporters of capitalism, and they admire really the United States. Mexican liberals have a vision of the future for Mexico, and the way they see the future of Mexico is that Mexico should imitate the United States in everything. That the United States is the model for development. This is how Mexico should develop. You know, the United States is developing a capitalist economy. Well, we should adopt a capitalist economy. They say, well, if the United States is building industries, they're creating an industrial revolution, we also need to industrialize as well. If the United States is an export economy, they're major exporters of products to different parts of the world, particularly Europe or the Caribbean. Well, Mexico needs that as well. We need ports, we need trade, we need enterprises that will be generating products for exports to attract foreign monies and capital into Mexico and the like. And they're also called Federalists because they're also, the liberals are trying to imitate the political culture, the political institutions of the United States, this federal system of government. They want to maintain a federal system of government divided by three levels. Remember, the local, the state, and the federal level of government. They want to retain that kind of political system as well. And they're going to become a major political force in Mexico. In fact, the liberals in Mexico were the ones that believed that the only way to achieve progress in Mexico, so Mexico can become like the United States, is by inviting the Americans in Mexico. Inviting American entrepreneurs, American capital, American financiers in Mexico so they can bring their capital, their technology, their ideas, the know-how, if you will, of how to transform Mexico. So the liberals very, very early on in Mexico wanted to create what is called an open door policy with the United States, pretty much opening the doors to Americans to come into Mexico and bring, once again, capital and technology, both. Okay? They have a very um, close connection, close ties to the U.S., if you will. For that reason, Mexican liberals, both in Mexico City but also in the province of Texas, will be thinking about pursuing economic development in Texas. They see that, well, this is a province that is the closest to the United States, and if we transform Texas into a capitalist state, then from there on, the rest of Mexico will just simply follow suit. You know, we can start from Texas instead of starting from Mexico City and then spreading capitalism around the country. We can actually start bringing capitalism through the north, through Texas, that is to say. Let's start from there. It is easier for Americans to move into Texas, that is to say. Okay? So, Mexican liberals are trying to adopt the American economic model, again, of creating capitalist enterprises and transforming, of course, Mexico with modern infrastructure. What is infrastructure? They want modern roads, well-developed roads. They want very well-developed bridges, ports, and eventually, of course, they're talking about railroads as well. You know, systems of transportation, that is to say, that facilitate commerce and trade. That's what infrastructure meant during this time when people talked about infrastructure. Okay, well-developed roads, bridges, ports, and of course also railroads as well. The way to do it, they said, is let's invite Americans into Texas. Let's promote American settlement. Let's invite the Americans into Texas. So by doing that, they're going to start pretty much developing the state. They're going to bring capital and they're going to start developing different kinds of businesses and enterprises. And this is going to kickstart capitalism in that region. So in 1825, we see the very first policy. This is really an open door policy, really, that was called the American colonization in Texas, 1825. So this is really the beginning, if you will, of really opening the gates to Americans to come into Texas in great numbers and settle there once again in order to develop the state. This is a liberal, if you will, policy. The Mexican liberals push for it, that is to say. And this has the total support of liberals in Texas, like the Navarros, for example, and others. So the idea is, look, we have to do it in a way that this is going to become very attractive for Americans to come in here. And the American colonization policy of 1825, what is stated is that the way this colonization is going to take place is through contracts, you know, establishing a series of contracts with Anglo-American empresarios or immigration agents. An empresario back then, which really, again, this is really a word that translate in English as entrepreneur. Empresario and entrepreneur is the same thing. But from a colonization point of view, the word empresario means an immigration or colonization agent. This is a person that is going to sign a contract with Mexico City in order to bring thousands of American settlers into Texas. The empresario or the colonization agent will be given a land grant to start a colony, an American colony, that is to say. And the land grants range between 11,000 to 22,000 acres, each colony, that is to say. So this little colony, if you will, was The smallest one was about 11,000. The largest will be about 22,000 acres. And the idea is that, look, we're giving you this land for you to bring settlers into Texas. So you will have to go into the United States and advertise colonization. How are you going to do it? Well, it's up to you. But you have to make it very attractive. You have to bring families that are, in good standing, with the United States, that they don't have any criminal record, for example, and they have to be let known that they have to abide by Mexican law because they're coming into a different country. They have to abide by Mexican law, and that this is a Catholic country as well, so they're going to have to also respect the Catholic faith, the Catholic traditions, and perhaps even convert, if you will. Yeah, those were kind of the terms, if you will, of the deal, of the contracts, if you will. Okay? So there will be a series of colonization agents or empresarios who signed contracts with Mexico City. They were given land to start a colony, and they started bringing Americans. So from 1825 all the way to 1833, through those empresario contracts, we see the influx of 30,000 Americans settling in Texas. Okay, settling in Texas. And they're, of course, settling in the land of the different empresarios, if you will. They're not coming to the same place. It all depends which empresario is bringing you. Of course, you're going to go to that place. Okay, you're going to settle there. By 1833, Texas has now a large number of Americans living there. If you compare it to the number of Mexican residents, of course, Mexican residents are about 4,000. There's only 4,000 Mexican residents, but there are now 30,000 Americans living in Texas by 1833, and they're bringing with them, once again, the spirit of capitalism. Okay, they are bringing capitalism with them, this idea of private property. Again, remember, capitalism is a system that one of the central pillars of the system is the idea of private property and free enterprise, that is to say. So they're really coming with this idea that, well, I'm coming into Texas, I have been given land by the empresario, and now this land is mine. Okay, it's my personal property. And I'm developing here a farm. I might be developing a little cattle ranch, or might be developing a plantation. Doesn't matter. But this is my property, that is to say. The other thing is that those Americans are also bringing with them Protestantism, because the United States is largely a Protestant country. This is not to say that they're not really Catholics in the United States, but they're a minority. The vast majority of the settlers in Texas, the American settlers, are Protestants. Okay, so they're introducing Protestantism in a Catholic country as well. And of course, this is going to be also an issue. Remember, we talked about that in session 1. The rise of Protestantism, in England, eventually led to conflict with the King of England, King Charles, because King Charles was Catholic. And of course, that produced the English Civil War, of course. So, of course, what we're going to see is that there will be significant differences and even frictions between the American settlers and the Catholic Church in Mexico City, that sees now the presence of Protestants in Mexico as a form of competition. Okay? This is something that we're going to actually discuss in just a few moments. Okay? Now, the Mexican Tejanos, as they were called, Tejanos is just the term that was used to describe or refer to the Mexican residents, if you will, of Texas, Tejanos, and the Anglo Americans. Both really were, in the very beginning, working together, like the Navarros and other wealthy rancher families. Uh, they really considered the influx of Americans in the province as a positive sign because look, we're both working together to modernize the state. We share the same vision of modernization. We want to transform this state to become just like, for example, any of the states of the United States, like Louisiana, for example. We're developing enterprises, trade, land development is taking place. We see also during this time that some of the Americans coming into Texas were very wealthy plantation owners from the American South. Cotton was going through a boom in the United States as a result of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in the United States was largely centered around textile manufacturing, textiles, clothing, fabrics, and the like. And of course, the raw material that was used to create those textiles was cotton. And the U.S. South was producing cotton for the mills up north. So there was really a boom, a cotton boom in the United States. And of course, southern planters were really looking for more and more land where to grow the cotton. And they were coming to Texas precisely to grow more cotton. Okay? And Texas is now in the process of developing a cotton-based economy, is getting started. There's now a growing number of cotton plantations that are exporting the cotton to the United States. And of course, this was considered also quite positive by the Tejanos in this province. Okay? We're also going to see the rise of commercial enterprises in Texas. Now that we understand that there's an influx of Americans coming into Texas, we're going to see the development of different kinds of commercial enterprises. One of the most important ones that is taking center stage just before the Texas Revolution was land development and real estate. Okay. So why is this? Well, because the empresario contracts that I just described a moment ago, in which Mexico City gave a land grant to a colonization or immigration agent to bring Americans. Well, part of this contract is that if the empresario fulfills his part of the bargain of bringing Americans, he was also given additional land for his own personal use. So that was part of the bargain, is that they're getting paid, so to speak, with more land. And what are they going to do with this land that they're receiving as a form of compensation or as a form of reward for bringing colonists into Texas? Well, what those empresarios or agents are going to do is use this land for real estate purposes. Okay, well, I got additional land. I got a lot of land. And what I'm going to do is develop this land. Pretty much, bring in surveyors to make a study of this land, look at the resources. What kind of resources are we looking at? Forest, for timber? Are we looking at a coastline, for fishing industries? Are we looking at very fertile soil for agriculture? Are we looking at land for grazing animals like cattle? Do we find rivers here, bodies of water, and so on and so forth? So they're making a real study and assessment of the land. And what they're going to do is pretty much divide it into different plots, okay, the land. And they're going to say, well, after we conducted the survey, and this study, we determined that this section of this land is useful for cattle ranching, this is for cotton agriculture, this other land here is for farming and mining, whatever. Okay, so they put a tag, a price on each of those sections, and they started really selling land to investors coming from the United States, industrialists or cotton plantation owners, or plantation owners that want to grow sugar in Texas. Didn't matter. But now they're turning their little colony, the additional lands that they have, into an enterprise. It's called real estate, that is to say. So real estate is born in Texas. This is very important. Again, they're now speculating, if you will. They're saying, okay, look, I know that the price of land for farming is now this, but if I wait another 5 years, maybe the price of this land is going to increase fivefold because of the way the market is moving. The price of food is increasing. There's more demand for food. Maybe I'll wait, another 5 years before I sell this land, and so on. They're speculating. They're actually making predictions of the value of the land in the future. That is what real estate is all about, by the way, okay? And one of those empresarios that is really beginning what is called real estate in Texas was Stephen F. Austin, by the way, who was one of the forerunners of the very early colonization process in Texas. If you recall, something we covered in the past. His father, Moses Austin, signed a contract with the Spanish in 1820, 1821 to bring families into Texas, and Stephen F. Austin pretty much fulfilled that contract after his father, of course. So Stephen F. Austin is not just a colonization agent, he's also a real estate agent, okay, because he's turning this colony into a different kind of business venture, a different operation, if you will, okay. And he was, for a time, the most important, the most prominent real estate agent in Texas. Okay, he was bringing, once again, investors, planters, and the like into Texas to buy land. He's not just bringing colonists, but he's also selling land, in other words. Okay? But ultimately, he's going to face competition. There will be rival real estate companies, particularly American real estate companies, that will be coming down here into Texas and pose a serious challenge and competition to Austin's companies and interests. There are a handful, for example, of New York firms that will be arriving to Texas precisely to engage in the same kind of operation in Texas. They signed contract with Mexico City to bring colonists from the United States. They are given land, and they're going to use that additional land for real estate purposes. Those New York firms were like Galveston Bay and the Texas Land Company. Galveston Bay and Texas Land Company was one of the New York firms that were bringing Americans into Texas. Other New York firms constituted the Union Land Company and Trinity Land Company. So there are a number of New York firms that are now posing a challenge to Austin interest. And the reason why this is happening is not just commercial interest. Is that, we are in the same business and we are a competition to one another. There's also another element to it, and that is that Northerners, that is in the United States, fear that Texas is becoming more and more dominated by Southern interests. The U.S. South, that is plantation owners. That plantation owners in the U.S. South are the ones that are dominating the market in Texas. They're getting the most fertile land for themselves to grow cotton or sugar, and they're going to, along with it, bring slaves. So this is the fear in the United States, in the northern states like New York, for example, is that Americans living in the northern states where slavery has very limited or almost no presence, is that they feel that Texas will become ultimately a slave state. This is not really part of the United States. Of course, this is part of Mexico. But a lot of Americans want to come into Texas and also own land for farming, but they fear that the most fertile land, the most productive land, will be seized by southern planters to grow cotton and sugar through the use of slave labor. So these New York firms that I just mentioned, the Galveston Bay and Texas Land Company, the Union Land Company, and Trinity Land Company, for example, were bringing colonists from the United States from the northern states. Many of them were farmers. And the advertisement was that, well, we'll take you into Texas because we want Texas to be free, to be a free state, free of slavery. So come into Texas and farm there. So the southern planters will not end up actually dominating all the land and so on. So again, this provided a kind of incentive or a land rush, if you will, in which also northerners felt very compelled to come into Texas to prevent the total takeover of Texas by slave owners, that is to say. Okay, so this is why the New York firms, see Austin as a rival, because Austin was primarily bringing southern planters and allowing the introduction of African slaves into Texas. So this is how Texas begins to look at, by the late 1820s, a province that is now subdivided into different colonies. And the name of the colony bore the name of the colonial or agent, if you will, the empresario, the immigration agent, if you will. You got the Austin colony, you can see here in what today is Central Texas. The Austin colony, he had another colony here, of course, in the Gulf Coast. The DeWitt colony, the Cameron, the Woodbury, McCullen, and so on. If you can see, there's only one colony that was given to a Mexican empresario, Lorenzo de Zavala. It's a Mexican liberal. And he had a colony that was on the easternmost part of Texas, almost bordering with Louisiana, by the way. The rest of all the other colonies are actually American, if you will. Those are American colonies. The colonies of the empresarios, again. This is where Americans are moving into and pretty much developing different kinds of enterprises. All right. Now, I mentioned just a moment ago how cotton agriculture is going to emerge in Texas during this process of colonization. There was a boom in the United States, a cotton boom, as a result of this increasing demand for cotton by the industries in the United States up north, but also in England. England is going through its own industrial revolution and is demanding larger and larger quantities of cotton. This is one of the reasons why Americans and also Mexican liberals in Mexico City and in Texas were promoting cotton agriculture, the development of a cotton economy in Texas. They believe that this crop was becoming like gold. It was actually called white gold during this time. And so if Texas will become a major producer and exporter of cotton to the world, they said, well, this is going to be the key. This is going to be the key for pretty much transforming the state into a capitalist economy. So there's going to be a push to actually allow for the massive expansion of cotton plantations in Texas by, of course, inviting southern planters from the United States to acquire land in Texas to develop cotton plantations, of course. In 1830, we see this with a policy largely sponsored by Jose Antonio Navarro, who is now a senator of Texas in Mexico, who is really pushing for an open door policy in Texas, pretty much inviting southern planters to come into Texas and grow cotton, okay, and awarding large tracts of land to them in order to grow massive quantities of cotton, and large cotton plantations, that is to say. The idea is, well, as we're going to be developing those large cotton plantations, we're also going to be using the monies that will be flowing into Texas through those cotton exports to improve the state, build roads, bridges, and of course eventually railroads. We need an international port from which we can export the cotton, and of course Galveston was decided to be the point of import and export of cotton, if you will, or the import export of products at large, the international port, that is to say, okay, Galveston. I mean, this is really, again, a very well developed plan by Mexican liberals like Navarro to really start building Texas in this fashion. So cotton plantations are going to now emerge as another dominant enterprise in Texas. It's not just real estate, but also cotton plantations and cotton agriculture. Now, of course, the question is, what about the labor force? Because, who's going to grow the cotton? We got the land, and we're going to have a lot of people coming over, of course, from the American South to start developing the land and growing the cotton. But what about the workforce, the labor force? Well, in the American South, slaves constituted the backbone of the cotton economy. They were the workforce in the American South producing all of the cotton, okay, in the United States. So obviously, if we are going to develop cotton plantations in Texas, what the liberals were saying, like Navarro, was, well, we need to allow the import of African slaves into Texas. The problem is that there are certain laws already present in Mexico that prohibits the practice of slavery in Texas. Okay? They're not that explicit, but it's understood in Mexico that this is an institution that is not legal, in other words, okay, even though it might be practiced here and there in different parts of the country. So Navarro introduced a bill to allow the imports of African slaves into Texas from the American South in a way that changed the status of those slaves while pretty much retaining their position as a slave. That instead of calling them slaves, in other words, you'll be able, if you're a cotton plantation from the American South, you'll be able to import your own slaves into Texas, but they're going to be called indentured servants. Those are servants that are serving for 99 years. Again, so it is really slavery by another name. That's what it is. This is just a loophole, a way to disguise, the practice of slavery under a very different term or name, if you will. The slaves will not be called slaves, but they're indentured servants in this position for 99 years. After 99 years, they can earn their freedom. Okay, so really, again, who lives 99 years and then becomes free after that? So, of course, this bill that was introduced in the Mexican Senate pretty much opened the doors, the floodgates, for American southern planters to flock into Texas now in greater numbers and bring with them their African slaves now. So we see the introduction of African slaves in the province of Texas. Okay, something, of course, that is not going to be welcomed by everybody in Mexico. There will be a strong opposition to slavery in Mexico, and as a matter of fact, this is going to be the fourth factor that is going to push Texas into the revolution, if you will, is that in Mexico we're going to see a strong opposition to slavery in Texas, in that Mexico, at least some groups within Mexico, some of them will be liberal, but there is also going to be conservatives, of course, in Mexico. They'll be now pushing for anti-slavery laws, again, anti-slavery laws in Texas. And of course, as those laws were introduced and affected the interest of the slave owners in Texas, this is going to pretty much move those interests, the slave owners, the cotton plantation owners, if you will, towards independence. In other words, look, Mexico is abolishing slavery. Well, we need to declare independence from Mexico. It's like secession. We need to secede from Mexico, in other words, something on those lines. There was an opposition to slavery in Mexico very early on, starting around 1813. Again, this is the very first time that we see a strong opposition to slavery in 1813. And this is when the Mexican independence revolution got started. When Mexico moved towards independence from Spain in 1813, there was a proclamation by the insurgents, one of the revolutionaries, again, groups in Mexico, that they were declaring independence from Spain and they were abolishing slavery at the same time. So again, this is not really a law. It was a proclamation, a statement during the independence process. Now, in 1827, Vicente Guerrero, the president of Mexico, who was liberal, by the way, was a staunch opponent to slavery in that he introduced a law called the Law of 1827 prohibiting slavery in Mexico. Okay? In other words, look, we do not condone the practice of slavery or the slave trade, and it's outlawed, if you will. Was not necessarily a law that was enforced. It continued to be practiced. For example, I just mentioned how slaves are imported into Texas by simply changing the name of slavery from slavery to indentured servitude. Again, so this is a law that, at least on the surface, is prohibiting slavery, but people are finding loopholes or ways around it, if you will, to continue practicing slavery. Now, as I mentioned just a moment ago, Americans coming into Texas are very divided on the issue of slavery. They come into Texas, but not all Americans that come into Texas support slavery. There are those that come from the north. There are northern farmers that are coming into Texas that they don't support slavery, particularly because slavery is a system by which exploits human beings. For example, other Americans might think that, well, slavery is a system that takes away jobs from other people because, who's going to pay a wage or a salary or monies to anybody to do anything when they can actually have a slave to do it for free. Other Americans coming from the north oppose slavery on on the grounds that, uh, well, all of the land will be seized by planters coming from the U.S. South to grow cotton and sugar, and this is going to deprive American farmers from actually owning any land. So there's many reasons why northern Americans coming from the north oppose slavery. Of course, southern planters don't see anything wrong with the institution. They're coming into Texas to grow cotton or sugar, and they're coming in with their slaves, of course. So they're competing interests over Texas. Americans are divided, in other words. Now, in 1828, in the United States, we see the election of a new president called Andrew Jackson, who, while in office, became very interested in Texas. He's a sympathizer of Southern interests. He himself was a plantation owner, owned slaves, by the way. And he was pressured by his peers to go ahead and just buy Texas from Mexico. Because again, Southern planters want to see Texas becoming part of the American Union, of course. Now that they're coming into Texas and developing cotton agriculture and bringing slaves, they will say, well, Texas can potentially become another slave state. And Andrew Jackson actually offers $5 million to Mexico to buy up Texas. And of course, after a series of talks and negotiations, Mexico declined the offer. Of course, this is going to set off a lot of criticism inside of Mexico. Mexicans began to worry, if you will, about the future of Texas. That how long will Texas stay as part of Mexico? They will say. Americans are already trying to buy it and the like again. So this is going to generate a lot of worries and concerns, if you will. Now, Austin's rival real estate companies, the ones I mentioned, the New York firms, the Galveston Bay and Texas Land Company, for example, also oppose slavery because they're from the north. They're part of the northern region of the United States that oppose slavery. And they are bringing a lot of American settlers into Texas, trying to win the race, if you will, against the southern planters, trying to pretty much sell land as much as possible to northern farmers and European immigrants. They're also bringing European immigrants into Texas. Now, in Mexico, in 1830, in Mexico City, what we're going to see is that people are beginning to worry again about the increasing presence of slaves in Texas, the increasing presence of southern planters who are pretty much dominating the economy through their cotton agriculture now, and the politics there. And when, of course, there were motions, if you will, to start, for example, Andrew Jackson trying to buy Texas from Mexico and the like, Mexican public opinion is beginning to now move away from this open door policy. At least, there's now in Mexico, people are entertaining second thoughts about, are we going to see the time when Texas will detach from Mexico and so on and so forth. So in Mexico City, we see the introduction of a bill to restrict the import of African slaves. Okay? So once again, this is the very first bill from Mexico City that is really trying to limit the presence of African slaves, not because of the African slaves, but because of the power, the emergent power of the slave owners, if you will, in Texas. Okay, the American plantation owners that are actually coming into Texas, and they're pretty much dominating the politics of the state. There is going to be, of course, some intrigue, if you will, by the New York firms in Mexico City, pretty much fomenting those ideas. In other words, the New York firms I just mentioned in Mexico City are convincing Mexican politicians that the slave owners in Texas are plotting to declare independence, that they want to detach Texas from Mexico so they can create a slave state that will join the American Union. So there's going to be a kind of panic, if you will, in Mexico City, a panic that led to the anti slavery law of 1830, if you will. In 1834, Stephen of Austin arrives to Mexico. He was sent actually to negotiate or to actually investigate what was really going on. He's very concerned that Mexico City is changing their attitude towards Texas. They're now trying to abolish slavery, limiting the presence of African slaves, if you will, in Texas. And as he goes into Mexico City, he's going to be arrested. He's really falling out of favor, that is to say. He realizes that the American colonists are at stake now. In other words, that their property, their interests, their enterprises that they have been developing for years is at stake. That Mexico City is changing course. That now they see the Americans as trying to, once again, detach Texas from Mexico. So while in prison, he's going to be starting, he started writing laws, Austin, that is to say, to his peers in Texas, warning them of the situation, that he was in prison and so on, and pretty much preparing for independence. That the situation is dire, we have fallen out of favor, and our interests are at stake. Mexico might abolish slavery or might just void all of the contracts, all of the land grants that they have been given. They can be voided. Once again, property rights, in other words, are at stake. Okay, so this is going to, of course, move situation, of course, towards independence. Now we're gonna make a stop here because we have reached our an hour and 20 minutes. It's about an hour and 21 minutes now. And when we come back, we are going to continue with part 2. There's still some issues to develop or to discuss in part 2, the causes and the origins. In session 3, we're going to finish part 2 and move into part 3, which is really the independence or revolutionary movement of 1836 when we come back. Okay? This is all I have for you, and I'll see you then in session 3 when we come back. Thank you.